Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
She texted me. It'll just be immediate family woke while posting selfies from the airport with my sister, and that was the last straw. I was sitting on the couch with a lukewarm cup of coffee. I'd already microwaved twice when her message popped up, all casual and cheerful, like it hadn't come loaded with a whole decade of subtle manipulation and uninvited drop-ins. The text came through at 10:42 in the morning, exactly 3 minutes after I'd seen my sister's story go live. Smiling faces, matching luggage, Starbucks cups held up like some kind of travel ritual. Terminal C, Gate 22. She'd captioned it, "Girls Trip, baby," with a little sparkle filter that only made me more annoyed. As if the audacity needed a bit of glitter to make it go down easier. My mom's message, just 6 words, was the kind of sentence that sounded harmless, unless you'd lived through the implications of it at least a dozen times before. It'll just be immediate family. No punctuation, no context. Just dropped like a grenade into my morning routine. I stared at the screen long enough for the auto lock to dim it out. When I flicked it back on, it still read the same, and so did the caption from my sister, who last I heard, was supposed to be helping out with my cousin's move this weekend. Not jetting off somewhere warm and sunny with the woman who had assured me, less than 24 hours ago, that she was so overwhelmed and couldn't afford a break right now. The thing is, this wasn't the first time I'd been the afterthought in my own family. I'd hosted Thanksgiving 3 years in a row, cleaned the house top to bottom, taken PTO just to make sure everyone had fresh sheets and a stocked fridge, only to find out later that my mom and sister had been coordinating extra girl time at spas and wine tastings without me. They'd always throw it in at the last second. "We didn't want to burden you," or worse, "You seem so busy lately, hun." The excuses were like clockwork, but what really stung each time was that they knew I would have dropped everything if they'd just asked. I own my house. Well, the bank owns most of it, but my name's on the deed, and it has a finished basement with a private bath and a separate entrance, something I'd added specifically with family visits in mind. My mom had her own key. My sister used the garage code like it was a hotel pass, and for a while, I'd told myself that was fine. This was what families did. We forgave and made space, and then made more space, until one day you realized the space was no longer yours at all. The final straw wasn't even the surprise visit. It was how casual they were about it. How they knew I'd find out, but assumed I'd swallow it like I always did. I went upstairs to my little home office, pulled out the rental agreement I kept in a locked drawer, the one that outlined the conditions for use of the downstairs space. I'd added both their names to it out of generosity, with a note that they had access during holidays, or with prior notice. I'd told myself that clause gave me control, but the truth was, it gave them loopholes, and they had become experts at wiggling through them. I stared at the line that read, "Immediate family permitted access with 24 hours notice," and for the first time in years, I saw it not as a boundary, but as a surrender. I picked up my phone, not to respond to Mom, but to call my property manager, Sheila. She'd helped me draft the lease after a nasty roommate experience in my 20s, and she answered after 2 rings like she always did. "Sheila," I said, "I need to update my access list. Remove Sandra and Ellie, effective immediately." There was a beat of silence before she said, "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied, just simplifying things. After we hung up, I stared at my mom's text one more time, then finally responded with something that sounded just as harmless and vague as her original message. "Thanks for the heads up," I wrote. "I'll be making some updates on my end too." The phone rang less than 5 minutes later. I didn't answer. I could picture her on the other end, probably thinking I'd overreacted, probably ready to launch into her usual monologue about how I took everything so personally. I left it ringing and turned my attention to something I hadn't noticed in weeks. The quiet of my own house. No footsteps overhead, no extra dishes piling up, no one adjusting the thermostat or changing the Wi-Fi password because they'd forgotten it again, just silence. That night, I took their framed photos down from the hallway wall, not angrily but carefully, almost reverently. I wrapped them in newspaper and stored them in the basement closet. I didn't throw anything out. I wasn't erasing them, but I was, for the first time, giving myself permission to reframe what family meant under my roof. Then, just before heading to bed, I picked up my phone and opened Instagram. My sister had posted another picture. This time, they were already at the resort. Cocktails, palm trees, sunglasses that cost more than my monthly groceries. I clicked on the little ellipsis icon in the corner and selected Mute Story. Just like that, I took a deep breath and exhaled. And that's when her text came in. "You did what?" The thing about silence, the kind that follows a purposeful decision, is that it rarely lasts as long as you hope it will. By the time I was pouring my second cup of coffee the next morning, because, of course, the first had been forgotten somewhere on the bathroom counter next to yesterday's mascara, and the list of things I'd meant to do but didn't, my phone had already buzzed 8 times. The first was a message from my sister, short and clipped, as if we were having a business disagreement instead of a family reckoning. Seriously? No punctuation, no warmth, and certainly no attempt to understand why I might have reached the limit of my patience. The second text was from my mom, and it was exactly the kind of thing I'd come to expect from her when things didn't go her way. Not aggressive, not outwardly angry, but something that nestled itself into your conscience and curled there like a guilt-soaked snake. I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. I let both messages sit unread for a while, not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because I genuinely needed time to collect the fragments of emotion that were threatening to scatter in every direction. I wasn't sure if I felt vindicated, heartbroken, relieved, or some unbearable cocktail of all three. It was the kind of emotional cocktail that tasted bitter going down and left a long, slow burn in your chest afterward. I turned my phone face down on the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a solid 20 minutes, not even blinking, just existing in the awkward, unfamiliar space of finally standing up for myself, without a clear plan for what came next. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. Or maybe it was just habit, but I picked up the phone again and scrolled through the messages. My sister had followed up with a second text that read, "Why didn't you say something before just doing it?" And that one made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was ironic in the most painful kind of way. I could have wallpapered my living room with the number of conversations I'd tried to initiate over the years, about boundaries, about needing notice, about wanting them to see me as more than just the free Airbnb of the family. And each time, I'd been met with deflection, justification, or worse, the kind of saccharine sympathy that says, "We're sorry you feel that way," which, as everyone knows, isn't an apology at all, but a dismissal dressed up in polite language. So instead of replying right away, I started typing out a list, not to send, just to see it in black and white. A list of every time my mom had shown up without asking, every time my sister had brought friends to crash for the weekend, without warning, every time they'd left dishes in the sink or turned the thermostat up to 80 because they run cold, or had their Amazon packages delivered to my house because it was just easier. I listed every time they made plans with each other and left me out, only to claim afterward that they didn't think I'd want to come, or figured I was too busy. I stared at the list until my eyes blurred, then closed the Notes app without saving it, because deep down, I knew they'd never see the list for what it was. They'd see it as an attack, not a defense. By the afternoon, my voicemail had one new message. I didn't recognize the number, which meant it was my mom, calling from a resort phone, or a burner line, or whatever temporary solution she could find, now that I'd muted her on social media and ignored her usual number. Her voice, when I finally gave in and played it, was full of that carefully constructed disappointment I'd grown up with. She said she was hurt that I'd done something so permanent without talking it through, that it felt like I was cutting her out of my life, that I'd made her look ridiculous in front of Ellie. That last part stung, not because it was true, but because it revealed what she cared about most. How she looked to others, not how I felt. I didn't call back, I didn't reply. But I did do something else that felt small and silly and maybe even a little petty, which was exactly what I needed right then. I opened the shared Netflix account, the one I paid for, but they used more than I did, and changed their profiles to kids. I adjusted the settings so they couldn't switch back without a passcode. I set the language to Norwegian just for good measure and renamed the profiles to Respect Boundaries and Ask First. It was dumb. It was childish. It was perfect. That evening, I walked through my house and noticed how still it was. No suitcase blocking the hallway. No laundry baskets full of someone else's things. No empty wine glasses tucked behind couch cushions. For the first time in what felt like months, I could see the corners of my home again. And they felt like mine. I cooked dinner in silence and ate at the table without checking my phone, without listening for footsteps overhead or wondering if someone had invited themselves in through the garage door. At 9:37, my phone lit up again. This time it was an email, subject line, from Mom. It wasn't long and it wasn't particularly heartfelt, but it was, in its own way, an olive branch. She wrote, "I'm sorry if I made you feel like you didn't have control over your own home. That wasn't my intention. I'll give you space, but I hope we can talk soon. Love but disappointed, Mom." I read it twice, then a third time, then put the phone down. I didn't know yet what I was going to say. I didn't know if I even wanted to say anything. But I did know one thing with absolute clarity. Something had shifted. And whether or not they understood it yet, I wasn't the same person who quietly made room for everyone else anymore. And just as I was turning off the kitchen lights to head upstairs, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't from Mom or Ellie. It was from my cousin Rachel. Her message was short and filled with curiosity that felt just a little too performative. "Hey, is everything okay? Your mom's been saying stuff. Want to fill me in?" I stared at it for a long moment, then locked the screen without responding because I knew what was coming next. Family spin control, whispered stories, and secondhand judgment. But what they didn't know yet was that I'd stopped playing the role they'd written for me a long time ago, and I had a few edits of my own. The knock on the door came late on a Thursday afternoon, right as the sun was casting that golden kind of light that makes you think, just for a second, that maybe the day's ending better than it started. I had just finished vacuuming the hallway, something I never used to do in the middle of the week because, frankly, what was the point when someone was always showing up with muddy boots or dropping a suitcase in the entryway, and I wasn't expecting anyone? Which is exactly why I froze for a second when I heard the familiar rhythm of knuckles rapping 3 times, then a pause, then 2 more, like a code I didn't know I'd memorized. It was Ellie's knock. And of course it was her, because no one else in my life shows up without even the courtesy of a text. Assuming that because we share blood and a few photo albums, she doesn't need to ask for permission to cross my threshold. I didn't answer the door right away. I stood behind it for a few moments, not quite hidden, but not visible either, waiting to see if she'd knock again or maybe just take the hint and leave. But she didn't. She stood there probably with a half smile on her face, and that little head tilt she always did when she was about to pretend she didn't know why I was upset, when in reality she was perfectly aware and just hoping to deflect it with charm and casual arrogance. Eventually, I opened the door, not wide, not welcoming, just enough to let her know I was there and not in the mood for games. She was holding a paper bag from the bakery down the street, the one she knew I liked, and she offered it up like a peace offering, or maybe a bribe, depending on how you looked at it. "I figured you'd want a croissant," she said, as if that explained everything. As if the smell of flaky pastry could erase the sting of betrayal, or at least make me forget the last 24 hours of silence, spin, and not-so-subtle manipulation from both her and Mom. I didn't say anything right away, just took the bag and stepped aside enough for her to see that there was now a keypad lockbox on the inside of the door, installed just that morning with only one active code, mine. She noticed it immediately, and I saw her expression shift, just a little, before she caught herself and tried to play it cool. "New toy?" she asked, but her voice had that brittle edge to it that only comes out when she realizes she's not in control of the moment. I didn't answer her question, just walked back toward the kitchen and let her follow if she wanted. She did, of course, because Ellie never backs down, when she thinks she has a chance to talk her way out of accountability. She sat on one of the bar stools and watched me pour myself some tea, the kind of scene we used to do a dozen times a year, only now there was a weight in the air that couldn't be ignored. "I just don't understand why you'd make this so dramatic," she said eventually, her tone somewhere between exasperation and self-righteousness. "You could have just told us you needed space." I set my cup down a little harder than I meant to and turned to face her fully. "I have been telling you, Ellie," I said, my voice steady but not soft. "I've been saying it for years, actually. Every time I asked for notice, every time I said I needed quiet weekends, every time I suggested you book a hotel, if you were going to bring 3 friends and treat my house like a hostel, I was telling you then. You just didn't want to hear it because it was easier to pretend it wasn't a big deal." She rolled her eyes, which was classic Ellie, the nonverbal equivalent of calling me overly sensitive without having to say the words. "It's not like we were taking advantage of you." "That's exactly what it was," I replied. "It's always been that. You and Mom have this way of assuming my time, my space, my money. It's all fair game because we're family. And I'm tired of being the only one who ever thinks about what that actually costs." There was a pause then, a longer one, and I thought for a second she might apologize or at least try to meet me halfway, but instead she shifted tactics, as she always did when the direct route didn't work. "Well, Mom's been really upset," she said, her tone softening in that calculated way that made it sound like concern, but felt like pressure. "She's been crying, Julie. She says you're freezing her out and she doesn't know why." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictably manipulative. I almost had to admire the consistency. "Of course she doesn't," I said, "because then she'd have to admit that she was wrong, and she'd have to admit that she's been putting her comfort ahead of mine for years." Ellie looked away then, fiddling with the strap on her purse, and when she finally looked back up at me, her face had that familiar mix of guilt and defensiveness that made it impossible to know whether she truly felt sorry or just didn't like being on the receiving end of consequences. "I just think it's sad," she said finally, "that we can't talk without it turning into this." "No, what's sad," I said, standing up and walking toward the hallway, "is that it took this for either of you to realize I meant what I said." I opened the door, gently but firmly, and stood beside it, the universal signal for time to go. "You're welcome to come back, Ellie, but not without asking first. And not until you stop thinking that showing up with a croissant counts as making things right." She didn't say anything else, just nodded slightly and walked out. I closed the door behind her and stood there for a long moment, the bag of pastry still in my hand, cooling now and probably a little stale around the edges, much like our relationship. I didn't eat it. I didn't throw it out either. I just set it on the counter and watched the sun slide lower in the sky. Later that night, I got a DM from my cousin Rachel. Just 5 words, but loaded with implication. "Mom is talking. What's going on?" And I knew then that the next wave of damage control was already in motion, that while I'd been setting boundaries, they'd been spinning stories, painting me as ungrateful, dramatic, maybe even unwell. But what they didn't understand, what they never seemed to grasp, was that my silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy, and I had a few more moves left to make. I've always believed that real apologies don't come with disclaimers, don't arrive in waves like stormy tides trying to erode the shore you just rebuilt, and certainly don't show up after you've already cleaned the wreckage they left behind. But that's exactly how they came, one after the other, spaced just far enough apart that it was obvious none of them had spoken to the others before reaching out, which almost made it worse because it meant they weren't united in understanding what they'd done, just panicked at the realization that the access they'd grown so comfortable with had been revoked by someone they didn't think was capable of closing a door and keeping it closed. The first one came from Mom, predictably sometime around dawn, the time she usually reserved for her I couldn't sleep texts, which she used to send whenever she was worried about something trivial, like a bill she couldn't remember paying or a show she thought I'd like that had been canceled. This time, though, it was different. The message was longer than usual, the tone hesitant in a way that felt almost rehearsed. like she'd gone over it several times in her head before hitting send. She said she was sorry for not being more sensitive, that she didn't realize things had gotten to that point, and that she wished we could talk face to face instead of through all this distance. But even in her attempt at contrition, there was that unmistakable thread of maternal martyrdom woven through it, as if her hurt somehow equaled mine, as if my decision to reclaim control of my home had wounded her as deeply as her repeated boundary crossings had wounded me. Then about 2 hours later, Ellie chimed in. Hers was shorter, more casual, almost as if she were trying to act like the past week had just been a weird dream we were both waking up from. She wrote, "Hey, been thinking. Maybe I took things for granted. I didn't mean to make you feel used or dismissed or anything. I really didn't know you were that upset. I get it now, okay?" It was a classic Ellie move, offering an apology that doubled as a deflection, packed with enough vague language to avoid admitting any specific wrongdoing, just a general acknowledgement of discomfort that she hoped would be enough to smooth things over. She even added, "Let's just reset, yeah?" As if our years of imbalance could be rebooted like a phone with too many open apps draining the battery. The third message didn't come from either of them, but from Rachel, who I hadn't spoken to directly since the whole thing began. Her tone was warmer, more sincere, and while she wasn't involved in any of the recent chaos, she had apparently heard enough from Mom and Ellie to know that something significant had happened. She said she didn't want to pry, but that she supported me and understood that sometimes family could be the heaviest kind of love to carry, especially when they expected you to bear the load without complaint. She didn't take sides, but she made it clear she saw me, and in that moment, I realized how rare it was to feel seen without being judged or fixed. I didn't respond right away to any of them. Instead, I went for a long walk around my neighborhood, letting the breeze and the sound of birds and the rhythmic tap of my boots on the sidewalk settle the noise in my head. As I passed familiar houses with their neatly trimmed hedges and wind chimes dancing in the early afternoon light, I thought about how many times I'd played the role of the reliable one, the anchor everyone else tied themselves to, confident that I wouldn't drift no matter how rough the waters got. But anchors rust too, and eventually even the strongest chains snap when pulled in too many directions for too long. When I returned home, the house felt different, not in the physical sense, but in that intangible way that happens. When you've reclaimed a space that was once a stage for other people's comfort. I lit a candle, made myself a sandwich, and sat down at the table with my phone in front of me, the messages still unread but hovering like ghosts. I wasn't sure I was ready to exercise. Eventually, I decided to respond, not because I was ready to reconcile, but because silence, while powerful, isn't always the end of the story. It's often just the comma before the next sentence. To Mom, I wrote, "I appreciate the apology, but we're not there yet. I need more than words. I need a change in how you see me, not as the fallback plan or the safety net, but as a person with limits that deserve respect." I didn't sign it with love, just my name, because I needed her to understand this was coming from the adult version of me, not the daughter who used to patch over every crack with forgiveness. To Ellie, I replied more bluntly, "Resetting doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. It means starting fresh, with rules, with respect, and with the understanding that I'm not interested in hosting people who don't consider my needs. If that's too much, then maybe we need more than space. We need distance." I didn't respond to Rachel. I didn't have to. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just offering understanding, and sometimes that's enough. Later that day, flowers arrived. A bright, over-the-top arrangement of lilies and tulips and tiny white filler blooms whose name I never remember. The card was unsigned, but I knew it was from Mom. The handwriting gave it away. It said, "Let's talk. I miss you, always, no matter what." I stared at the flowers for a long time, then placed them in a vase and set them on the table, not as a gesture of acceptance, but as a reminder of where we were and where we might go next. That evening, just as I was pouring myself a glass of wine and considering a quiet night in, I opened Instagram, mostly out of habit, and there it was, another post from Ellie, another airport, Another round of matching selfies with mom. Same smiles, same luggage, different location, same lack of awareness. I didn't say anything. I didn't send another message or call or delete the flowers. I just stared at the screen for a long moment, then locked my phone and turned it face down on the counter because some stories don't need an immediate reaction. Some endings deserve to simmer before they're served. And I had a feeling this one wasn't over yet. There's a peculiar kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort or lack of rest, but from the quiet, constant erosion of your boundaries over time. A weariness that settles somewhere beneath the surface like sediment, making it harder and harder to tell the difference between peace and numbness. And that's exactly where I found myself on the evening I realized. Despite the apologies, despite the flowers and the carefully worded messages and the awkward attempts at reconciliation, nothing had actually changed. Because there, glowing on my screen under the familiar filter that gave everything a rosy, false warmth, was yet another picture of my mother and sister, smiling as if they hadn't spent the past week dancing around the consequences of their actions, this time posing with their arms around each other near another airport terminal, same matching suitcases, same practiced grins, same tags about how family always finds a way. And it was that caption, more than anything else, that made me understand we were not, in fact, anywhere near healing. I didn't react, not right away. I didn't send a text or write a scathing response or even call Rachel to vent, although I knew she'd answer and I knew she'd understand. Instead, I closed the app, set my phone down on the kitchen counter, and stood there for several minutes, staring at the untouched dinner on the stove and thinking about how many times I'd let them back in, not just into my home, but into the parts of me that still wanted their approval, still believed that one day they'd see me as someone whose time, space, and emotional bandwidth were worth protecting. But every action they'd taken in the past few days, carefully couched in politeness and performative guilt, had only reaffirmed what I'd been trying so hard not to believe, that they didn't truly regret what they had done. They only regretted the reaction it provoked. So I decided, for the first time in what felt like years, to act not out of anger or obligation or even wounded pride, but out of clarity. I texted both of them, separately, intentionally, without the sugar-coated tones they were used to, and told them that if they wanted to have a conversation with me, a real one, not filtered through guilt or manipulated through tears, they would need to do it in person, at my home, not unannounced, not with flowers or baked goods or thinly veiled requests for sympathy, but with honesty, directness, and a willingness to listen without defending themselves at every turn. I told them they could come next Sunday at 3 p.m., and that I would expect a call ahead of time to confirm. Nothing more, nothing less. That Sunday, the call came at 2:59 on the dot. Mom's voice was cautious, soft in a way that didn't feel like fragility, so much as restraint, like someone who knew the old tactics wouldn't work this time and wasn't sure what else to try. "We're outside," she said, and I told them to come in. I didn't rush to open the door. I let them find their way to the living room, let them sit in the chairs they hadn't occupied in months, chairs that had once been synonymous with comfort, but now carried a charge I wasn't sure could be fully discharged. The conversation started awkwardly, as expected. Mom talked about how she'd felt blindsided, how she thought I was just going through a phase, and how the flowers had been her way of showing that she cared. Ellie mentioned the croissant again, which almost made me laugh, because it was such a perfect metaphor for everything. Offering something small and sweet, and expecting it to erase a mountain of accumulated disregard. But then something shifted. Maybe it was the way I didn't interrupt, or maybe it was the fact that I wasn't trying to smooth things over for once, but they started to talk, not just defend, and for the first time, I heard something different in their voices. Not just remorse, but discomfort, the kind that comes from finally seeing yourself through someone else's unfiltered eyes. I told them what it had felt like for me all these years, not with dramatic anecdotes or a laundry list of complaints, but with plain truth, that every time they assumed I'd be okay with one more unannounced visit or last-minute plan, every time they dismissed my need for space, or question my reactions, they were slowly teaching me that my boundaries didn't matter, that my life was theirs to schedule around, that I existed to provide, accommodate, absorb, and that somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like a member of the family and started feeling like the concierge of it. They didn't interrupt, not once. And when I finished, there was a silence that didn't feel like avoidance, but absorption. Ellie was the first to speak, and to her credit, she didn't try to minimize it. She said, "I really didn't get it before, but now I do, and I hate that it took this for me to see it." Mom nodded, slowly, tears forming, not the manipulative kind I'd seen before, but the quiet, overwhelmed kind that suggested maybe she finally understood the weight of what she'd been asking me to carry all these years. We didn't hug, we didn't cry together or plan our next get-together. We just sat for a while, the kind of stillness that feels like a pause, not a full stop, and when they stood to leave, I walked them to the door. As Mom turned back for one last look, she opened her mouth to say something, but I held up the keyring in my hand, the one that used to have spares for both of them, now reduced to a single house key and my car fob, and I said, "Just define immediate family again, Mom." Out loud, right now. She hesitated, opened her mouth, then closed it again. "You," she said finally. "You're the one I should have been thinking about first." That moment, small, raw, almost imperceptible, wasn't an ending or even a resolution, but it was a shift. And that's all I'd been asking for. They left quietly, no promises made, no reassurances exchanged. And as I closed the door behind them, I realized that closure isn't something you receive from other people. It's something you claim for yourself when you decide, finally and fully, to stop explaining your worth to those who never really listened. So that's where I leave it. Not with dramatic exits or tearful reconciliations, but with a house that feels like mine again, a silence that no longer feels like punishment, and a future where immediate family means the people who don't just love you in theory, but respect you in practice. Whether they ever earn that status again is entirely up to them, and for once, I'm completely okay with that.